Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first meeting of the Implementation Committee for 2026. I'm so happy that you could join us. The objective of this meeting today is for us to discuss a draft Cultural Heritage Ordinance for Sint Eustatius. Just to give a little background, the implementation committee is tasked with some very important responsibilities. I'll just highlight two. Number one, we are responsible together with the descendant community of St. Eustatius to rebury, honor, and remember the ancestral remains that were dug up from the 18th century Golden Rock plantation. You know, those remains are now currently stored at the Heritage House, and we are pushing for the remains to be reburied this year, more specifically November 13th, 2026. That is our objective. Now, another important task is for us to brainstorm together with the community of Statia about ways in which we can safeguard our cultural heritage. And one such way is for us to bring forward an ordinance that would help to protect what's happening locally. And so for that, we contracted Tackling Law on St. Maarten to brainstorm with us about that. And we have our very special guest here, Miss Carla Vlaun, and from Tackling Law, and she will be presenting her findings to us. The idea is that we let her present, and then if we have any questions, clarifications, we can ask those. And then if we have anything to add, we would also be given that opportunity to do so. Then we will think about the way forward, and then the meeting will be closed. So without further ado, I would like to give the word to Miss Carla Vlaun.
Morning. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. So Xiomara already gave a background of the project and what we're here for today. So we began last year with research to create the Start Notizzi for the Cultural Heritage Ordinance that would address the concerns that were already raised within the reports that have been drafted by the SHRC and previous articles and documentation that were related to different heritage related topics on Sint Eustatius. And so today's report our presentation will go over some of the legal foundations and the issues, of course, that we were able to establish in order to establish why there would be a need for legislation in this situation. We then identified international heritage frameworks to learn about best practices within the region, in the Netherlands, also to see the different formats in which countries have decided to protect their heritage, to see what would be most feasible. Then I'll present a focus specifically on how heritage protection has been set up for small island developing states, to understand then how different factors that SIDS face and how that has translated into effective programs for heritage protection. Then discussing the different approaches and what would be the best fit with the final recommendation that we have for the structure of this legislation. So currently, we saw critical deficiencies that were identified in the report that was done that highlighted this study, which was a huge lack of community consultation requirements and unclear oversight regarding the CCAR mandate that was originally in place. That the Malta Convention is indeed applicable, but lacks the implementing legislation for the territory, because of course we can say that various international treaties are applicable, but in the end, our own islands or governing territories need to then implement through their own legislation and means what is laid out in these conventions. There's no explicit heritage protection provisions in the spatial planning framework or the building regulations. They only have technical standards. So we also looked into the legislation currently on Statia and whether those legislations could be adjusted to fit the need for protection of heritage sites. But we see that currently there is indeed a gap in the current provisions of these legislations. So we see that there's no legally mandated need to include participation of the community. There is unclear distribution of oversight authority when it comes to a situation like this, which was already highlighted in the previous report that was done by the committee. That indeed, if a situation arises in which certain artifacts or heritage sites are found, it is unclear then who is the ultimate authority and who would be the final decision maker, or not who would be the final decision maker, but the power that is shared between the different institutions that become involved. We have insufficient professional standards for archaeological practice, inadequate transparency mechanisms, and then a heavy reliance on external funding and expertise. And then ambiguous heritage definitions, which of course, without defining what you're protecting, it's very hard to know whether it fits the bill. So this translates into 6 systemic problems within the legal framework, which is the absence of mandatory community participation rights, unclear oversight, authority, and distribution, and insufficient professional standards. And these interact in a way to say that there is no legal guarantee for certain, for example, affected communities to have a voice or to know that they will be consulted. And when the community then does articulate even their position on certain things, there is no formal framework in order to take in what is expressed. And we don't have enforcement mechanisms to then say that what is expressed should be followed up on by any of the entities involved. There are inadequate transparency mechanisms, so we don't have a legal guarantee either for public disclosure when something of significance is found. There's then this obviously undermines the democratic oversight, and we've seen that through the work that the committee has done that there is expression from the youth that they want to be involved in heritage processes and the education around heritage as a topic. So the resource allocation is constantly requiring for external dependency. So right now there's a heavy reliance on external experts, which of course we would want that the people of Sint Eustatius are also provided with opportunities and tools for training to be involved in meaningful manners. And that indeed, without, as I mentioned before, without defining exactly what fits heritage, because in the last discussion that we had last year with the committee as well, we already, I think, started to open Pandora's box about how the boundaries of heritage could be defined. And when we're going from tangible to intangible heritage and these different notions of protecting just archaeological items is also not just heritage in its whole, right? So we were looking into then, of course, how is this defined in other legislations? So we see that we also have a need for legislation that we had to establish before developing an ordinance, which is that there should be legal certainty, which is a constitutional principle within Dutch law, that the current ambiguity then violates legal positioning in terms of having stakeholders not know their clear rights, obligations, and procedures when it comes to this particular topic. You fall under international obligations by the Malta Convention, Faro Convention, and different UNESCO conventions on intangible heritage. There's fundamental rights that are given and protected for social and cultural development as a state obligation, that there has to be cultural participation as a fundamental right, and ancestral heritage protection as a matter of dignity. And And so the fact that we see these protected within legislation, both at the level of the Netherlands, and that should, through international obligations, also apply to Sint Eustatius, already establishes a sufficient foundation for why national ordinance or non-national ordinance should be developed. And then, of course, there's the characters of public good, which is the fact that heritage transcends individual property rights. Market forces at this moment prioritize short-term economic gain over preservation. And only legislation can really create the necessary coordinated frameworks that are needed to not repeat the past mistakes that we've seen within situations regarding heritage protection. So within international heritage frameworks, and we really focused on frameworks that we saw more here in the Caribbean, but obviously, of course, looked at Europe, Pacific Islands, the Netherlands, more in specific, to see how other islands had protected their heritage or structured their heritage frameworks. And so we saw three distinct models of legislation, and that was one, comprehensive statutory frameworks, then sector-specific legislation, and then minimal frameworks with more community management. So for the first, for comprehensive statutory frameworks, we see these examples in the Jamaica National Heritage Trust Act and the Trinidad and Tobago National Trust Act. And there we see single institutions that have very broad mandates that are then integrating the multiple heritage categories and processes that are laid out within their legislation to be able to protect heritage as laid out within those legislations. Then we see sector-specific legislation, which we see in Cuba and the Dominican Republic, and that's where they have separate laws for different heritage types. And so we see that there are different institutions that would, for example, be in charge of archaeological excavations versus preservation of monuments or cultural sites, etc. But then this requires then still precise regulatory tools of how those institutions then end up working together. And it requires coordination across multiple agencies in order to ensure oversight for the entire field of heritage protection and preservation. And then we see other frameworks, the final one, which is minimal frameworks and more community management. And we can see this in Antigua and Barbuda and St. Kitts, where they have basic legal protections for heritage sites. And then they set up an NGO, or there's specific community organizations that are identified that then implement certain preservation not techniques, but practices. And this is the framework that acknowledges most the constraints of smaller governing apparatus within small island developing states. And this is particularly in acknowledging already the constraints over permitting processes and procedures and bureaucracy within small island developing states, but acknowledging that bureaucracy and limited capacity should not hinder then the advances made towards heritage protection. And then, for example, in the Netherlands, to take it to that level, we see that they have the national agency. And there we see, of course, that they have a complex permitting system. They have extensive technical reviews and professional archaeological standards. And this is then implemented by the central agency that has stronger oversight and fits in with their permitting system in general. So then when we look at the specific situation for Sint Eustatius, where we're looking at a population of about 3,270 people, a GDP of 96 million in 2023, a limited pool of professional expertise. And we see that, like the majority of Dutch Caribbean islands, I think we are all in the same boat, that we do not sustain the specialized departments that we would maybe see in situations like Jamaica or Trinidad and Tobago, which they themselves are also highlighting that the lack of oversight or the lack of reach and certain values missing amongst certain individuals when it comes to heritage also leads for abuse. And so we see the structural constraints of having a small government structure that has officials that end up having many caps that they have to fill. And we all have to balance that we face brain drain. And so how do we also connect with the broader network of Sint Eustatian people who are station people, Sint Eustatian people, station people abroad who are also contributing to this field of work, despite not maybe being still based in Statia, but of course operating within the field of heritage, but in other places. And so we see that in other Caribbean islands, there has been large struggle with implementing heritage legislation in its current formatting, I would say. And then the issue is then how can we have a system that contributes to the protection of heritage, not just through negative mechanisms, so enforcing fines, but also positive. So that is actually growing values and concepts related to heritage protection for Statia people, and to have this or supported or embedded within legislation. So we then see for smaller governments that when we have a heritage coordinator role, we tend to concentrate specific needs within one certain individual. So we either expect one individual to fit the different capacities, and here we can see that a heritage coordinator in the sense of a national or an ordinance related to heritage protection would then have to oversee archaeological permits, coordinate peer review, manage community consultation, maintain heritage registries, conduct evaluations, and liaise with international organizations. And at times, then we see that this can, if this is not concentrated within one person, the use of external consultants also raises the price related to protecting heritage. And in moments where you want to protect heritage, you wouldn't want this held back by the idea that the entity cannot afford it in that moment, and this person cannot fill that role either. So we see that in practice, you need archaeological skills, built heritage skills, conservation, GIS, and database analysis. And it's difficult sometimes to find and afford this within a single person that has all these competencies. But then you also have the risk of bureaucratization and perpetuating this need for external consultants that I just discussed. So, of course, there are enforcement challenges that are tied to limited personnel. So, before I go. So then when doing the research, it was the idea to, and discussing with my colleague, how to open up the legislation to allow for it to also put a basis together for more, to allow for also different means for station people to be able to protect their heritage. So not just in the traditional sense of permitting, which indeed can and should still exist, but to also work alongside growing values, education around heritage. And so we see that in traditional approaches we have seen towards heritage protection, you have prohibitions and sanctions and extensive permitting requirements, only centered within the government, and it assumes that private actors threaten heritage, right? So they're putting protections in place, assuming that these persons, without the lack of oversight, will indeed bring damage to certain things of cultural significance. But then we can see that we can also have a positive approach within law that discusses more enabling and facilitating mechanisms, providing any incentive structures if possible, that bring in more community-led stewardship, and recognizes that the root causes around destruction of heritage are mainly linked to lack of awareness of heritage and certain importances, resources, and access to education about heritage. And so for Statia, we see that, of course, and through the work that the committee has already done, that it's going to be community support that's essential for the success. Because even in a prohibition sense, you have to have that people have and are carrying these values in order to also signal to the system once something is found. And that this would more lead to sustainable stewardship that would require or not that would require, but that would allow to give birth to more alignment, not just with economic interest and being able to move through projects fast, maybe once items are found, but truly about having persons believe in the entire process. And a positive law approach would then, of course, allow for a gradual capacity building to bring more skills and knowledge around the heritage sector, that as the legislation is being fully implemented in all of its stages, you would see that also station people are brought along with heritage protection and preservation initiatives. So it's all about building capacity and community ownership. The idea then to the legislation would be to set up a heritage fund. It would have dedicated revenue streams via the legislation. The institution that would oversee the fund would then also have a financial predictability for long-term planning and understanding how money can be distributed and towards what areas you can work on, including education or preservation of specific sites, heritage tourism, etc. And it would be able to receive, through the basis of the legislation, multiple funding sources, be it from the Netherlands, from the local government, from the EU, UNESCO, tourism foundations. There are different funds that are active at the moment and working and have their timelines, for which Statia is not a contender, but an option that they can tap into these funds to be able to then support the activities of the Heritage Fund. It would allow for capacity building mandates, calling on training programs, apprenticeships, giving out scholarships related to heritage, and making sure that there's a knowledge transfer that's happening from external experts to the community. It would allow for partnership framework, so for government and NGO collaboration, and also for reaching into regional heritage networks, and also calling on academic institutions to serve certain community priorities related to heritage sites once they're involved on the ground for certain research projects, to make sure that knowledge is not just being extracted from Statia, but knowledge is also staying. And of course, this can also work hand in hand with the idea of recognition and incentive programs, so giving awards for heritage stewardship and public acknowledgement for creating positive associations with cultural heritage. So you would have, through the legislation, which is our recommendation, this setting up of a community heritage board, which within could already have specific designations. So, for example, of the 5 or 7 positions, that 2 are registered for the youth, 2 related to academia, 2 related to archaeology. This is not the specific breakdown, but it can be divided this way in order to make sure that the Heritage Board is truly an inclusive setup. There would be a technical advisory panel, which can be on-call heritage professionals, that if certain issues arise, persons on the ground are able to know exactly who they can reach out to for assistance on specific matters. the heritage coordinator, which of course is a position that's already established on the island, would of course then be involved with administrative coordination from the government side. And of course, then there's ultimate government oversight of the board, as you know, that the board would then have annual due diligence to report to their specific liaison within the Island Council. And the advantage of this is that it enables a heritage protection despite any limited government capacity, because it's truly working on growth surrounded to the heritage sector and tapping into different funds that can help to protect heritage and to come up with different initiatives to make sure that heritage is not just something that is protected and static, but something that's living throughout the community. It creates sustainable funding independent of annual appropriation. So it also opens up the possibility to then, of course, create and generate funds and receive funds from just beyond the station government. So it's not limited to just their budget and what they are able to give for heritage protection. Then there's the focus on local capacity building. And really centering community decision making, even within the board and its structure. And the idea is then you bring heritage deeper into a community, and not just consulting them at random moments in which they are then heard or felt like they're heard, but at the end of the day, are there consultations and what come out of this really being embedded within heritage protection. So then I mentioned that the Heritage Fund can have various sources of income. So they would be able to run grant programs, capacity building, community engagement, technical assistance, heritage documentation, and strategic partnerships. And this helps to broaden the portfolio and to be able to function with additional members beyond just the singular heritage coordinator within the government. And allows for diversified funding sources, which in the report you will also receive a list of the multiple funding sources that were already identified that could be tapped into. And then there's, of course, different things that can be implemented, whether it's tourism revenue that's allocated specifically to this fund, or certain private foundations that can be identified, or different activities locally to generate money for the funds to continue the work of the fund. So the idea is to have a two-tier heritage protection system, and that's at tier 1 you have the regulatory framework, and this is really based about permits, impact assessments, and enforcement. It would work with the standard that we've seen across all legislation, which is the 50-year-old threshold for identifying archaeological artifacts or heritage, which would set us at a pre-1975 period, built heritage for exceptional design, historical association, demonstrable significance for heritage, underwater cultural heritage in line with the 2001 UNESCO Convention, and movable heritage, so objects of demonstrable cultural, historical, and scientific significance. So you would still have, of course, a permitting system that helps to protect the damage of heritage sites and enforce this, but it would then be supplemented by tier 2, and this splitting or the need to split also came from our last conversation, indeed, where we were considering what does heritage mean to station people, and to also allow for legislation that doesn't just identify what are the feasible things that we can protect through the legislation in a hard sense, but then also how do you support heritage in the broader sense that is understood by station people, and to then also help to support and document and educate around this larger sector. So the second tier would then allow for a more open definition of heritage, and also include intangible cultural heritage, community-centric heritage, cultural landscapes, natural cultural intersections, marginalized group heritage, and living heritage. And this would then allow for the funds to be able to support in any ways, even the private protection of certain entities that might be too hard or difficult to fit within the strict regulatory framework of Tier 1. So it would be a hybrid ordinance in the fact that it has these two tiers, but then the idea is to then have an essential regulatory framework around permitting and prohibition that still requires, of course, community consultation, but then also has specific appeals and dispute resolutions for when certain problems come up related to excavations. And then the Heritage Fund is then able to fund heritage as defined within Tier 1, but also Tier 2, and also then brings in more about community heritage stewardship and building capacity. And then the idea then, of course, is that Tier 1 is regulating to establish these minimum standards and prevent the most harmful activities towards heritage. And the fund would then create an enabling environment for voluntary excellence. So really inviting people to partake and support them within the heritage sector. So the report that we had seen, of course, was heavily based on what happened at Golden Rock. And we saw that there was external expertise without community authority that was involved in knowledge extraction. We saw that regulatory frameworks without any enforcement capacity were just paper protection and were not working in practice and didn't bring sufficient protection in the moment. Consultation rights without decision-making power is just seen as, of course, it's just tokenism. And then you start to question heritage protection without community benefits for preservation is working in whose favor. So we hope that this combination within the legislation would create social and economic impact with heritage at its core, helping to develop local expertise and really build on capacity building and bringing more people to not just consider heritage in the strict sense of a career, but that all persons have certain skills and knowledge related to the heritage sector and are able to, play certain roles with more of a capacity basis. And it gives more community authority over heritage priorities and resource allocation. And we have sustainable stewardship beyond any governmental budget constraints. And this would, of course, we hope, in its sense, focuses on cultural continuity through bringing in, of course, station people at this moment, but largely involving the youth and bringing these values and knowledge and sites into their arena of expertise as they grow up and leave, stay, come back, move around. So, are there any questions currently?
Carla, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful presentation. I really love that you started out with the challenges, the constraints, the challenges in terms of the fact that there are limited models that deal with true community engagement. And in Statia's case, and if you should involve community, there's no proper enforcement of that. So that's something that we need to guarantee. What I really love is that you looked at different models, each with their advantages and their disadvantages, and you took our thinking into consideration, the heavy focus also on community engagement. You talked about the constraints that local communities face. So one person wearing many hats, and you guys came up with a very eclectic framework that balances, regulation and capacity, because indeed that is a small issue, that is a big issue. And so I'm sure that persons will have questions, but I will start. The framework that you're proposing have different elements, one, two, three, four, where it seems as if the capacity is not just limited towards one person, but there are different players. And then my question would be, in terms of, for example, the Heritage Fund, which body gives this fund the authority? For example, is this something that, so it would be in the legislature? Would that be something that would have to come from, I guess, the Executive Council? That's my question. And then others may have questions, clarifications, and then we will move forward to maybe feedback that persons may have.
The legislation would establish the right for the board over the fund to exist. So it would have a basis to exist within the legislation to manage the fund and the activities related. Of course, it's not just about the fund, but also the related activities around distributing money related to the fund and the different activities. And so then we can always then discuss, of course, then, and like I said, there can always be specific definitions of, for example, who has to make up the board, like what profiles. This can all be fleshed out if it wants to be specified from the beginning. But the existence would the right to exist of the board over the fund would be anchored within the legislation.
Okay, perfect. All right, let's go over to those. Brother Kenneth, you said you have to leave in 10 minutes. I don't know if you have any questions for Carla, and maybe you could give your feedback before you leave, and then we can go over to the rest.
Yes, Carla, thank you for a very stunning and good presentation and layout of the issues. I have some question in relation to heritage versus the terminology monuments. That's one, because when you look at archaeology and you look at heritage, and again, when we speak about heritage, how do we define heritage? Because on St. Eustatius, for one, particularly which is most marginalized and destroyed and looted structurally is African heritage to start with. Colonial heritage sites are very much, although they are not on the UNESCO protected list, they are well preserved, et cetera, and taken care of. So that is one question. How do you look at that? How do we define that? And at times when you look at archaeology and you look at heritage, monuments do also could fall on the sector of archaeology and the other way around. So how do you look at that? Another thing which I think is important, and you spoke about community engagement a lot, which is happening in Statia and where you're seeing there's a sort of a monopolizing approach from government to monopolize heritage. And when you look at the Faro Treaty, which came out, I think, of the United Nations resolution of 27 in relation to human rights. The Faro Treaty was recently rectified in the Netherlands in relation to giving a community the rights to have input constantly and to define their cultural heritage in general. Now, this is not the case in St. Eustatius at all. So this is some of my questions in relation to the role of community, which is lacking. And then when you look at the role of the situation of a public body in Statia, the Dutch government, per definition, with the different ministries, control and have all mostly every input when it comes to legislation. We are speaking about what you call a public body, whereof the various ministries in the Netherlands, per definition, if you talk about the National Agency for Cultural Heritage, which you mentioned in your presentation, they fall directly under the ministry in the Netherlands of science, education, and culture. Now, when you look at these things, they are not happening in Statia because basically the Dutch central government decides, basically legislatively speaking, mostly everything. The local public entity has some leverage to design what you will call ordinance. And even to that, it is poorly ordinance when it comes to heritage in relation to legislation and ethical guidelines for that matter. So these are some of my contribution. I have to run to a next meeting in a few minutes, but I would like to hear your reaction as to these contribution which I'm trying to put into this framework which you so beautiful has already designed. Thank
So
you.
thank you for your feedback and indeed. So for the terminology, that's where I also ask for the committee's input in the sense of how we define heritage at the two different tiers, because of course tier 2 is with the hopes of capturing all heritage definitions in order to enable different activities related to all heritage categories. But then for tier 1, that is very strict in the sense of where we're seeing that we're asking for certain permitting processes or etc. When certain items or areas are being excavated or certain items are found. It is then in discussion with the committee how strictly we define heritage at tier 1. So that's, I think, a conversation that we're still going to have. And we provided, I think, last year a chart with all the different ways in which heritage is defined in legislations that we had already found. But that's up for discussion. So indeed, we see different terminology that is strict or enabling. And so then for us, it's important that when we choose the specific terms, we are then all aware of what would fit into that term or what would fall out of it. So indeed, would a monument fit into a certain terminology that relates to archaeological finds? And then indeed, for the different value system that we give to artifacts related to African heritage versus colonial sites, that is a valid question in the sense that, of course, the definition, even I think in its strictest sense, would fall on protecting heritage of related to persons of African descent or communities. And the question then there is, I think that the abuse is happening related to the value system. And that's why tier 2 then works on bringing more awareness towards these artifacts or what is found or practices, etc., for protection, because it would fit into the definition of heritage protection or heritage, especially if we're talking about physical objects, etc. So then the question is more that, are we making sure to influence and bring awareness to people's activities and practices, that when they come across these items, it does fit the bill of heritage and deserves to be protected at the same level, right? So I think that's where we can really see the tier 1 and tier 2 protection in terms of these things, items having the right to be protected and given to the rightful authorities when found, versus the education and the funding that has to be done around bringing awareness to this so that persons are actually acting on this. Monuments can indeed fall within the definition, and it's just then to make sure, for example, I can just give the hard example of that in St. Maarten, we have a few things that we have designated as monuments culturally, but they don't fit the 50-year gap right? So that's the catch.
Gotcha.
When there's a time limit related to heritage, which is this norm that we see, anything made post 1975, but that we value as a monument, would then end up being excluded from the legislation. So then the question is, are these monuments protected in other ways, or do all monuments fit this pre-1975 timeline? So that's also a good question and discussion to have to analyze, yeah, what is the list of monuments, and do they fit this 50-year timeline, or can they be protected through other means? So I'll also put that as a note to look into in terms of if we can get a list drafted to make sure. You have something to add?
Yeah, one brief point before I leave, and a very good explanation. Thank you for that. In relation to the role of a heritage inspector, whatever you want to call it, again, coming back to restriction and the obligation of a community to be informed, from taking my vantage point from a point of archaeology, for instance, which is in St. Eustatius, you have the Center for Archaeology and Research, whereof up until this day, for decades, they've been operating on the island. And by law, you're obligated to inform a community of findings, etc., etc. And even the recent excavation in 2021, the archaeologists report up until today is a mystery to community. So how do we put in place legislation which will actually obligate and limit the mandate of, for instance, Statia case, Seika has an absolute mandate to go and operate without even, consultation with government. So I think these are some important points as well. We need to look at an NGO organization which have an absolute authority to go about doing what they want on an island without any restriction. We need to have some kind of a safeguarding legislation where they obligate structurally to inform community, but also give accountability at the same time, which is not happening. So this is some of the ingredients as well. I would like to hear how do you incorporate that into this say blueprint which you are creating in this regard.
Because that was also the central idea, or not the central idea, but a central concern for what gave birth to the idea of having the fund that would be able to truly spread education and awareness about heritage in Statia. Because indeed, when we interviewed archaeologists from other islands about how they saw their legislation working in practice, they said that they too also saw a lot of abuse going on, in the sense that they knew of instances in which the persons involved in the government could be paid off, things would not be signaled, there wasn't always a clear communication to the public if something was found, because this would go against the economic timeline of a certain project. And so we saw that indeed when persons don't have necessary knowledge or awareness or values related to certain findings, that persons were pursuing faster economic gain than preservation. And when I asked them what they thought would be the golden key to fixing this, they said that of course there is no golden key, because you are at the mercy sometimes of the persons who come across what they have found, and the right to report it, and will a government always signal when something was found based on where they found it, etc. So for them, indeed, the only answer that they had was education and value, creating certain value systems. But they did obviously highlight that today, of course, they themselves are having problems connecting with the youth on certain practices and issues of heritage. So I don't have a easy fix-all answer that the legislation can bring, but it is the inherent idea that indeed, through spreading awareness and education, the more persons that care and understand what station heritage is, that hopefully there are multiple signals within the system, you know, that if someone is aware, for example, that certain remains were found on a project that they're involved with, and they don't see the government signaling for input from the community, that they would bring this then. They know that the Heritage Board exists, and this is a claim that they could also approach this more independent institution with, that's not a government institution, though it is government established in legislation, that these conversations and this signaling can happen. So you try to create kind of this heritage ecosystem that exists beyond at least the government and government persons, not saying that they're not labeling them as all bad, of course. But indeed, when you see that one person fits many hats and is stretched to certain limits, sometimes also mistakes happen just in the sense that they don't have time, they don't properly analyze a site, etc. It happens. And so how do we foster then this environment that allows for proper signaling and documentation?
Okay, thank you, Sister Carla and everyone.
Perfect.
Unfortunately, I have to rush into another meeting in relation
Yes,
to
yes,
a lot of these issues as well. Thank you, and we'll
yes.
continue the struggle together. Okay, have a pleasant
Thanks.
day.
Thanks,
Thank
Brother
you.
Kenneth. Bye,
Thank you.
Anita.
Bye-bye.
Okay, Carla, good point from Brother Kenneth. I'm going to incorporate two questions here for you, and if others have, please feel free. Anina is asking, are there examples where a two-tiered approach have or are working in communities, territories, or countries? So that's one. Number two, my feedback for you. I heard what you said about the inherentness of what Brother Kenneth is alluded to, because he's saying there should be consequences if persons do not adhere to certain things. And we want to safeguard our own African cultural heritage, which is really not given the attention in Statia, other heritages are. So I hear what you're saying about the educational aspect, but we think maybe some kind of consequential component should be incorporated. Also, Carla, we need to think about how do we incorporate existing structures in Statia when it comes to this heritage, because you have to this audience, you have the Monuments Foundation and you also have the Sint Eustatius Historical Foundation. They also deal with cultural heritages. And also, I think what is should be taken into consideration, and I think that it is inherent in what you're proposing, is that the structure that we put in place, the players, that they can function as autonomous as possible. So not having to depend too much on a change of government, a government philosophy. No, because when we do that, we know in small island states, then we are prohibited from, we are limited in what we can do. So you want this semi-autonomous or this autonomous structure to be part of this process. That's very important for us. Very important. So those are the two things. So the questions and the consequences, the existing structure that maybe should be taken into consideration, and that this fund, this heritage fund, along with the other components, that it be as autonomous as possible.
Yeah. So for the two-tier approach, we do see that for small island states like Antigua and Barbuda and St. Kitts, we do see that there is like this two-tier system, but more loose, right? So the reason for the legislation that we're bringing it in is also to make it more explicit. So we don't necessarily see that it is explicitly stated the way that we have within the legislation, but we do see other legislations that have, of course, split heritage protection between two different heritage types, and then, of course, have two different structures for protecting that heritage. And so for us, it's just that it should be explicit, and that's why it's not just that the foundation should protect heritage in a loose sense, or that the legislation would call for the Heritage Foundation or fund to protect heritage in this broadest sense, but that the legislation would provide those definitions. And so then going to the next question about consequences for African heritage. So it would fit the current definition of heritage. So there would be a consequential component because there would still be prohibition and permits related to finding certain items. Just because it is a different community group doesn't mean that it would fall out of the definition of heritage, right? So as we can look, so you have the 50-year deadline, but of course, things of African heritage would still fit. Where is the definition? It would still fit either being built heritage or sites that are found underwater or movable heritage, so objects of demonstrable cultural, historical, and scientific significance. So it would fall within the permitting system and enforcement. So if there are instances in which African heritage is not protected and the heritage found fits these definitions, you would still have the consequential component that's applicable. So I think the conversation that I was having more before is that education helps to fit the value awareness, because we see that certain persons are not valuing these items as much as other heritage items. But just because persons have a different value system does not mean that in practice, the legislation would not also protect things of African heritage descent. So it is just then being aware when these abuses happen, but the legislation would call for their protection and thus have to be enforced in the same way. As for existing bodies, the Monuments Foundation and the Historical Foundation, indeed, so the legislation would just make sure that it does not interject with their authorities, but it still will call for this possible same protection of certain items, but it will not be in contradiction to what they protect or how they protect it. But indeed, it is taken into consideration when we were doing the research. And as for the structure, there are various structures in which these boards and funds can be established. And if there is concern for who is appointed to these groups or how, and that it doesn't fall on a political will, you can have a board that is self-appointing in the sense that the board does conduct its own interviews for persons who would replace persons who leave the board, etc. So you could create a more independent ecosystem within this board that is established through the legislation that says that, you know, these certain rights would be applicable, and that it's not appointed positions. But all of this is option based on how the committee would then advise on how it would be set up. But there are multiple options that you can take in order to protect or to design the makeup of the board.
Perfect. Wonderful. Yes, we have a lot to consider. Petra has a question. If anyone else has their question, please raise your hand because we want to tie everything together and think about how we are going to move forward. And if you do not want to openly ask your question, you can also type your question. Or if after the fact you have questions, we can collect the questions and we will put them forward to Carla. Petra?
Yeah, thank you, Xiomara. And Carla, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. It was really, I got really excited reading all that and looking forward to have a legislation with all these things in it. My question is in line with what Xiomara was asking before. Maybe it overlaps a little bit about enforcement and government accountability and in the Netherlands, but I'm not advocating to do as things are done in the Netherlands, but just as an example, you have a body, an independent body that is the Cultural Heritage Inspectorate. And when something does not go right, you have always the possibility to go to that inspectorate. And I think it is the case in the Netherlands that each municipality has to submit an annual report to that body in which they submit the report in which they give accountability of how they complied with the cultural heritage legislation. So something like that would would be good for Statia as well because they're I think in Statia there are more risk factors because there are not so many eyes as you have in a bigger country. It's a small island. You have the colonial situation, you have a small population, and you have what in my eyes is a bit of a problem in Statia. There's not enough transparency between what the local government is doing and what the government, the several ministries in The Hague are doing. So as a citizen of the island, you won't always know, or many times you don't know where you have to go to address certain issues.
Yeah, we also happen to run the legal desk, so we indeed know of
Yeah.
the confusion with the multiple layers of oversight. But indeed, it's a question that I can discuss more with my colleague in terms of oversight over enforcement to ensure that when things go wrong, that indeed that the government can be held responsible to a certain entity that's independent. Yeah, we'll look more into it and see then what is possible to see if also it can operate with certain existing structures of oversight. Would this fall under the audit chamber? Can they also hold accountability over this and measure and see? So because that's also a possibility. I know that they do this for other issues related to the permitting systems. They are held accountable. So it's possible that this will already also fall within this capacity. Indeed, if there are certain heritage-specific knowledge needed, it's interesting to see, or we'll look into more how it can speak to this specific kind of oversight.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay,
wonderful.
thank
I
you.
like that
Yeah.
word, the oversight. In essence,
Oversight,
that's what it
yes.
is about. Yes, you need to
Yeah.
have that component built in as well. Great, Petra. Any other questions or suggestions from the others? Going once, going twice. Okay. There are people who like to reflect a lot, Carla. So perhaps there are no immediate questions at this point in time. But one of the ways that we can move forward with this, as I said, this is being recorded. We will share this. It will be shared on local radio as well. And if persons have questions and suggestions, we will capture those and we will forward those to you. And the idea is also to share this
You as well.
presentation.
Yeah.
Sorry, Carla?
I'll share the file of the presentation with you so that persons can also
Perfect. Yes.
Oh,
see,
great.
because I
That
know
would
that I
be great.
a lot that I dumped on, and there was and I said, okay, well, this is the workings of the structure. It's the most important. So, but
Yes,
it is
it's a
the
lot. It's a
conversation.
lot. It's a lot.
But
We'll
I think
share
that
this.
it's
Go ahead.
very important to have the especially in designing, because the next step would then, of course, be like specifying or narrowing down the start entity, because for now it's more of a research paper that I did in
Yeah.
terms of all that is possible and what is the recommendation from this. So it would narrow down to the start entity, which would also then, of course, focus on specific heritage definitions and how that fits
Yeah.
station
Yeah.
heritage. I think that I know that you had some discussions last year, but that is a
Yes.
very important next step, that if we agree with how it's structured, that is will provide, of course, I think, concrete definitions that you can work with to see, because I think it's easier to then just coming up with it based on what we already have within legislation. But to fine tweak it to make sure that for you as a committee and in your conversations with station people in general, that those definitions truly fit what you are trying to protect and preserve.
Yeah, that's very important. That's really where the community engagement comes in. It's ongoing, and also the voice of the youth is very important in this.
Mm.
So it is actually what we realize. It is an ongoing process. It's not as easy as we think it is. It requires that we cover a lot of bases in order for this to be something that we can all be proud of, and something that really reflects our local reality. So yes, so it's an ongoing process. So we will definitely revisit this. So you and I will continue with our engagement as well. And on the community level, we will, as I said, we have our WhatsApp group. The idea would be to have some conversations face to face with persons as well, to try and capture as many voices as possible, because this is something for all of us. It's not something for few. It is something for all of us, and we are trying to shape this. And Stacia, we will be setting a precedent also in terms of the other islands, within the kingdom, and hopefully when the other islands see our work as well, that it would also stimulate them, and even, for example, St. Maarten, to have its own cultural heritage ordinance or law, because we think that it is very important. But you have done great work, you and your team, and we really want to commend you.
Yes.
Well
Yes.
done.
Well,
Well done.
very well done.
Yes.
We
Any,
look forward to continued
uh-huh.
conversation.
Yes. Yes. Any closing remarks from anyone else? You, Carla? If not, we will close the meeting.
No, I'm just I will send the presentation and see what feedback there is, and then we can continue the conversation.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Someone said thank you. So, yes, we all thank you. So thank you everyone for joining, and stay tuned for our follow-up in regards to our Cultural Heritage Ordinance. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Bye bye.